Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining today's Force.com webinar. My name is Wade Wegner, and we're going to be talking about building customer applications using the Salesforce Toolkits for .NET. Before we get started, I'd like to say a quick message from our lawyers. Essentially what this safe harbor statement says is you should make all of your buying decisions based on products that are available today, not anything that we may or may not say that relates to the future in today's presentation. So as I said, my name is Wade Wegner. I'm a technical evangelist here at Salesforce, and I'm also the creator of the .NET Toolkits for Salesforce and for Force.com. I'm joined today by Richard Schroeder.
Hey Wade, I'm the Director of Product Management for the CenturyLink Cloud, Public Infrastructure as a Service, Microsoft MVP, a handful of other things, and happy to be doing this with you.
Great, thanks for joining me today, Richard. So you can follow both of us on Twitter. We're actually pretty active, and if you care to follow some of the updates around the toolkits or some of the things that we're doing within the .NET community, by all means, please interact with us, follow us on Twitter. We would love to converse with you. So before we get to the agenda and the presentation, I do want to share a few things here. If you'd like to tweet today, if you want to share anything fantastic that you've seen, you can do so on Twitter. We are using the Force webinar hashtag, so it's an easy way for us to track and to interact with you on Twitter, so please go ahead and do that. And for those of you that would like to share this video and recording with colleagues that are not able to join today, we will be posting it up on YouTube. So you can go to our Developer Force YouTube channel and watch this at your leisure. Now we do have a pretty packed agenda, and if you did see any of the announcements on Twitter, you know that we're going to try to show you a lot of demonstrations today. We really want to emphasize the tools that we've built that accelerate development with .NET and with Force.com, while also showing you some of the things that you can build. So before we get to the demos, though, I do want to walk through some important information related to these toolkits. Why we did it, what they are, some of our design principles, and so forth. And so we'll spend some time up front going through that before the demonstrations. And then at the end, we'll have time to not only provide a call to action, but also answer any questions that you may have during the course of the presentation. And we are joined by a couple of additional moderators on this call, so that during the course of this presentation, if you do have questions, feel free to ask them in the questions pane, and hopefully someone can get you an answer pretty quickly. So first up is, what exactly is the toolkit, and why should you care about it? So the toolkits for .NET that we've built are essentially native libraries that you can use to interact with the Force.com REST APIs, as well as some other APIs provided by the Salesforce1 Platform, such as Chatter and so forth. These native libraries are built and designed so that they not only work across multiple different Windows platforms, such as Windows Store apps, Windows Phone, and so forth, but they also work across different platform and OSs, such as being able to use them on an iOS and Android device. And we've accomplished this by doing two things. The native libraries are built as portable class libraries, which means that you can use the same library and the same APIs that are available in it for different platforms, whether you're building a Windows Phone app, whether you're building a console app, a web app, etc. We've also made it fully compatible with Mono.NET, which allows you to use tools like Xamarin to take these NuGet packages and these libraries and build iOS and Android apps on the Mac using the Xamarin tool suite. And we'll give you a demonstration of this later. But these native libraries are what make it possible. Now, to make it easier for you to use them, we deliver these through NuGet Packages. And NuGet Packages are essentially a way of packaging up the assemblies and resources used so that you can not only manage the dependencies, but as we release newer versions of it, you can very easily get the latest, version of the NuGet package. So it's dependency management along with versioning control. In addition to the libraries, we've built accelerators for Windows Phone, Windows 8, as well as web applications, things like MVC. And these accelerators make it easier for you to get started. They handle some of the details that are important, but may not always be the easiest for you when you're first starting to use the toolkits. And so, for instance, we have accelerators that make it easier for you to do the OAuth process across these different devices and give you some of the native controls you need in order to make it happen. We've got a set of sample applications that make it very easy for you to look at and give you some ideas and ways to get started. And then, of course, up on our GitHub repository, we have a lot of documentation around the APIs and some examples as to how it's used. At the end of the day, the goal we have with these toolkits is to really take some of the difficulty out when it comes to interacting with the Force.com APIs, essentially making it easier for you to build great .NET applications and focus on that experience for your customers versus some of the nuances in communicating with our APIs. So looking at why we built it, the .NET developer ecosystem is actually pretty substantial when you take a look at Salesforce1 development. There's a lot of .NET developers integrating with Salesforce, whether it's on the phone or if it's in a Windows Store app or even on the web. And so it's a large constituent of our platform. If you look at the Salesforce1 Platform API surface area, we have a lot of APIs. And so providing some native resources for developers when interacting with these APIs is important. We want to simplify the development process. We want to make it easier for you to be able to develop all these things. And then at the same time, trying to codify some of the best practices, showing you the best way to interact with these APIs. Now, these are justifications. I think the reality, though, is that for the longest time, we have not had very much for .NET developers. Folks like Richard and others have done a fantastic job of writing articles and wikis and Pluralsight videos, but when it comes to what Salesforce ourselves have produced, there hasn't been very much. So that's the primary reason why we started building out these toolkits, was to give you more tools and more resources. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the design principles, because I think this is important, and as you start using the toolkits in these libraries, some of these things are going to end up becoming significant. I did mention the multiple and cross-platform support. So you can see that these are built as portable class libraries. They work across many different platforms. So .NET 4.5 and 4.5.1, Windows Phone 8, Windows Store, and since we support Mono.NET, you can also build iOS and Android applications. In fact, you could use this on pretty much any platform that supported Mono.NET. As you'll see, by default, the APIs are asynchronous, and we did this on purpose so that as you're building for modern platforms such as Windows Phone and Windows Store, you're able to take advantage of the asynchronous nature of these libraries when building out experiences that your users interact with. We wanted to take full support of dynamics and generics so that as you're working with different objects and as you're interacting with data, it was very easy for you to do so in a native way where you're able to interact with a .NET CLR object, even if you don't know what its type is ahead of time. We wanted to make it simple yet extensible. As you start digging into it, you'll see that oftentimes we provide a constructor for interacting with it that will, in one way, new up your HTTP client. But let's say you want to take a little bit more control. You want to provide your own interaction with the HTTP client, maybe manage retries differently and so forth. We provide ways for you to override some of the default behavior, so that if your use case does call for a more advanced scenario, you're able to do that. I mentioned NuGet as a packaging mechanism as well as a delivery mechanism, and NuGet is how we deliver and make these things available. Of course, you can clone the repository and get access because we've made this an open source project as well. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but open source has been a very important part of this whole process for us, so that this is out in the community and in many ways built and supported by the community. A couple of quick notes about the engineering process. If you go out to the GitHub repository and take a look, you will see that there's an extensive amount of code coverage when it comes to both functional and unit tests. We wanted to make sure that we had really good support for functional tests so that as the Force.com APIs evolve and newer versions of these are released, we want to make sure that the interactions and the dynamics there for interacting with these APIs are consistent and we get the expected results. So we do have quite a bit of code coverage and a lot of different functional as well as unit tests out there. And in many ways, it's really nice to take a look at these functional tests because you'll see exactly how to interact with these APIs and to communicate with the Force.com APIs using the libraries. So that's been a a primary concern for us from an engineering perspective. We also use a continuous integration tool. You can visit our Travis CI build server. I wish we had more time in this call because I'd love to show it to you, but if you take a look at the GitHub repository, you can always see the status of the build and its health. Green is good, red is bad, and should be green right now. But we do this so that as we evolve the toolkits and as we provide more functionality or fix bugs, we make sure that all of our functional and unit tests run with each commit. This is also important when interacting and fixing bugs or issues or fulfilling feature requests that people place within GitHub issues. We use GitHub issues as the primary way to continue to evolve the toolkits. So if you find a bug or if you have an additional feature you'd like to see supported, you can go right out there to GitHub issues and go ahead and log a new issue, and we'll respond pretty quickly. And then the last point to make is we do look and encourage you guys to initiate your own pull requests. If you find something and fix it, or if you have functionality you want to introduce, it's very easy to use GitHub in order to initiate that pull request and send it along to us. And this is why the rest of the stuff that I mentioned here, such as continuous integration and code coverage, is so important. Because as we look to incorporate changes and additions that you've made, we want to make sure that things continue to operate smoothly. So now, before we get to the demos, a couple of things to point out. If you go to the repository, you will see that we have a number of sample apps, and I encourage you to take a look at them. And we also have the full source code for our accelerators. I'll be demoing these in a moment, but I think it's useful for you to be able to go out and know that you can take a look directly at all of the source that you can use and take advantage of when starting to use these toolkits. Okay, so we're going to transition to some demos here. You see that we've got 8 demos. Now we're going to do our very best to get through them all. If we start running out of time, we may drop 1 or 2, but we'll make sure that we give you guys some good coverage. And what I'm going to do when I start here is I'm going to show you how you can start to have your first experience when it comes to building out with these toolkits. So I'm going to go File, New Project, and what I'll do is I will create a simple console application. We'll use this as a way to introduce the NuGet packages as well as the API for the NuGets. So the first thing to note is you can come up here to your app, you can manage NuGet packages, and we're going to search for the NuGet package that we'll use. So if you type developer force, you'll be able to take a look and see all the different NuGets that are provided. Now the primary NuGet package that has the force libraries and APIs is developerforce.force. So I'm going to go ahead and install this. There's a number of dependencies that are chained to it, and they'll automatically be installed. And when this is finished, we'll actually have a reference to the assemblies needed for interacting with the force.com APIs. Now the first part of this process is to actually new up an authentication client, because we want to do an OAuth call, and we want to authenticate to the Salesforce APIs. So we'll create this client, and there's a number of different flows and authentication flows when interacting with the APIs. You can do a username password, there's a web server OAuth flow, there's a user agent OAuth flow. For the sake of the console application here, I'm going to show you the username password. And when working with this, what we'll do is we'll provide a client ID. This will help to tell the API which connected app to connect with. We're going to have a client secret. We'll have a username, and we'll have a password. And I'll provide the defaults for those values here in a moment. So by making this call, we'll be able to authenticate and start that authentication process with the force.com APIs. Now the next step is to create a client. And actually make a first note here. So these are asynchronous APIs. If you want to interact with it in a synchronous way like this, what I'll do is I'll actually wait on it. So what this is telling the API is go ahead and wait until you get a response before moving on to the next item. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a force client, and we're going to pass it a few pieces of information. The first is an instance URL, and that tells our API which URI and which URL to interact with when making subsequent calls. We're going to pass it the access token that we got as part of the authentication process, and then we're going to give it the API version that we want to interact with. One thing that's nice about the Force.com API is as it evolves, we version the API so that if you have code that's working today, it's not going to break the next time we release new updates because you're still going to be using that same API version. Now, once you have a client, you can start to interact and use that client to do things. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a query. And if you're familiar with T-SQL or P-SQL or any structured query language, this should look pretty familiar to you. What I'm going to do is just do a select, and I'm going to select ID, name, and description from account. And that's going to be my query statement. And now what I can do is say, results equals our client, and I'm going to do an asynchronous query. And what I'll do is I'll pass in a few pieces of information. The first is I'm going to pass in a type. I'm going to pass in an account object. And the reason for this is we're telling the API, the query async, what the type is that we expect to get back. Now, in a moment, Richard's going to show you how you can use dynamics to do this so that you don't have to know that type ahead of time. But sometimes it is nice to have that set up as a .NET CLR object. So being able to specify account here is pretty useful. And the last thing is I'm just going to pass that query in. Now, since, again, it's asynchronous, we're going to go ahead and wait on that call. And once it's finished, we're going to then create an accounts list. And we're going to take the results of that query and all the records and get all those records and load it into that object. And so now what I could do is a number of different things. I could iterate through it. So why don't I go ahead and just say, var account in accounts, and then just write to the console line the account name. All right, so let's do a couple of things here as well. So what I'm going to do is add the client ID, the secret, and then a username password. Now, to get these is pretty easy. What I'm going to do is flip over here to the portal, and you'll see that I've got a connected app set up and ready to go. And the connected app is really your way of interacting with the APIs. It's a way to authenticate as well as to start interacting with and getting information out of Salesforce. So I'm going to grab that consumer secret, or excuse me, the consumer key, and then get the secret here. And then I'm going to provide a username password since we are using the username password flow. So, and there's no need to try to copy these. I will be resetting these things after the webinar. So, let me check one thing here. So, oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out why account wasn't working. I haven't actually defined the properties on here yet, so apologies. So I'm going to go ahead and create some of these properties here. So the first one is going to end up being ID. Then I'm going to create the name. Then the last is going to be description. All right. So now when I come back and I start to iterate through the records that have been collected by our asynchronous query, I can end up going account.name. So I'm going to go ahead and build everything built and give this a run. So what we should see here is it's going to hit the API and, of course, print out all the different account names. And you can see I'm very creative when I name new accounts. But I do have a list here of the accounts within Salesforce organization. So what this is showing is really how quick and how easy it is to leverage the NuGet packages so that you can start to not only log in and connect with Force.com APIs, but start doing things like querying the API. You can create additional records. You can update records. There's support for Upserts and so on and so forth. So very easy to get started and to start using these NuGets to use these APIs. So let's move on. This next demonstration I want to show you is how you can use some of these accelerators to not only get the library for .NET, but then you can start going beyond that. You can start managing callbacks with authentication. You can start doing additional things. So what I'm going to do this time is create another new project. And I'm going to create a web project and select MVC. Go ahead and click OK. And what I'm going to do this time is not only install the Force.com library, but I'm going to use the accelerator to get some pieces of code. So in this case, with an MVC application, I'm going to end up getting a controller that's going to handle most of the authentication for me. So again, this is a way to accelerate your interactions with the Force.com APIs. So I'm going to go ahead and install developerforce.force.web login. And when I install that, you'll see that it does chain the same dependencies. So we get the Force library as well as some of our common libraries. But it's also going to install a few assets that are new this time. If you look now under controllers, you'll see that we have a login controller right here. And what this login controller does is it grabs some of this information, like the consumer secret and key and callbacks, from their web config file. It'll manage a login process. So you can see here it'll construct a URL that we'll use so that someone can log in. And then once they're logged in, we're going to end up getting a callback. And that callback is going to contain information that we want to use later on, things like the access token or the API version or an instance URL. And so you can see that that callback method is here as well. So that's great. There is a few things that we need to do. We'll open up our web config, and we need to add some of this data. So we need to add our key and secret. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll grab our consumer key and enter it here. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab the secret and add that here as well. Oh, apologies. I'm going to use a different connected app this time. So I'll use a different set of keys. That's because the callback URL is going to be different. So we'll add that, add the key. And the last thing to note here is that the port is going to be different for everyone as well. So that's because Visual Studio will end up hosting it locally. And so what you want to do is come up here to your project, scroll down, and see what port you're running at. So this is 11398. Now that's going to manage this here, so we'll pass this along, but what we also have to do is update our connected app here. So I'm going to end up updating this callback URL here, and save it. And so now the connected app knows where to end up redirecting that traffic. It knows what the callback URL is, so that when it's passing that information to me, it can. Now one thing to note from a development perspective is we're using this login.salesforce.com URL to facilitate and to initiate the login process. It does take a little while for changes to your connected application to propagate throughout our data centers. So a trick that you can use is just to specify what your instance is. And that way, when you're developing locally, you can easily and quickly get the updates so that you're not sitting around waiting for this stuff to work. So that's all I've had to do to update this MVC application. And let me show you what this login process looks like now in action. So when we open this up, we're going to get the default MVC experience. Since our login controller has a login action result, it's as easy as typing login. Of course, we could create a URL. But what you've seen here is very quickly, and apologies, since I was already logged in, it didn't actually initiate the login. But what you can see is we logged in, it used the cookie that was already there, and what it did is it ended up redirecting us back to our callback URL, and it passed a bunch of additional information there. And you can see this information ends up being things like our access token and our API version, as well as our instance URL. And so using that one NuGet along with some additional pieces of information, we've been able to quickly get the information we need to call back to this API. So let me show you one more demonstration before I pass along to Richard. And this is just a Windows Phone app. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this new Windows Phone app, and I'm going to use one of our accelerators for Windows Phone. And while that's loading, what I'm going to also do is come back and show you how I have this connected application configured. So in this connected app, what we have is a callback URI instead of a URL that just lets us know that we've had a successful login, so SFDC success. And we're going to use that so that our Windows Phone app knows when we've successfully authenticated, and then it knows to parse and extract some of the information needed for additional calls. So I'm going to go ahead and install our package. This is developerforce.force. In this case, it's Windows WP8 login. And the Windows Phone has a slightly different experience, and so what we're also going to get along with this package is a set of XAML pages that will facilitate this login process. So you'll see over here in the solution pane, we're going to end up getting now an additional folder called Pages that includes the login page XAML. And in here, we've got a web browser, so you can see the web browser that's going to facilitate this OAuth login. And then in the code behind, we have some things that you're probably getting familiar with. In this case, it's a consumer key and some other information. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this consumer key and update the sample app. And I'll just point out that, again, we're going to create the URL that we're going to navigate someone to for the login. And then down here, we're going to handle the navigating event. And when we've had a success, we're going to extract that information out of that query string that comes back to us. Now, the one other thing that we have to do here is we want to log in first before we end up hitting that main page. And it's pretty easy to change here in a Windows Phone app. You can just come into the manifest, and we can say pages/login page. And when we run this now, we should be able to show exactly what this experience looks like. And to demonstrate this, I will put a breakpoint in the main page, and then we can look at some of that information here. All right, so you can see here is, here's the login. So here is our Windows Phone emulator, and I'm going to go ahead and put in my credentials. Log in, and I'm going to be challenged to allow access, basically giving the ability for me to interact with this, and I'll log in. And so we've hit our breakpoint on the main page now, and if I just come down here and if I take application.current as app, so basically I'm casting the current context, and then if I look to see if there's an access token, you can see I now have access to the access token. So this means that I can easily move forward and start making additional calls against the Force.com API. So that's a very quick, although interrupted, look at some of the tools and things that we've built to provide to make it easier for you as .NET developers. And what I'd like to do now is switch this over to Richard Schroeder. And what Richard's going to do is show some of the things that he has built using these toolkits and using some of these accelerators. And I give you a more detailed look at some of the possibilities. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Wade. Wade's left me a few minutes left. He knows I thrive under pressure, so let's see if we can crank through some of these demos and show you something interesting. So first, I want to talk through dynamics and using dynamic types. And why do we use those? It's to bypass some of that static type checking because you don't know what type that might be till runtime, or you want to be a little lazy and not have to declare all those types. If you look at the toolkit code itself, you'll notice as I look at operations in the toolkit and we look at the source code and we see how we get information, you'll notice that information does come back as a JSON message. And the toolkit's using the JSON.NET toolkit to figure out, is this an array, is this a particular object, and it's returning that. So Wade did show you that I can look at that information and type it when it comes back, or once I get through my authentication code, I've got a query operation. And you'll see in this case, I can actually do a simple dynamic object. So here I'm querying, select things from contact. I'm not casting that to a specific type like Wade created a contact type before. I'm simply bringing that back as a dynamic object. And then I'm able to pull back, because it's a collection, the list of records, and then yank out the properties that I'm pretty sure are going to be there. So in that case, I didn't have to define a type. I don't have to define upfront how this is going to work. It's going to be great for certain flexible scenarios when I want to be able to not have to define all this ahead of time. If you look at my instance, in Salesforce, I have 4 contacts in here today. So just we'll see if I run this, I should get those same 4 back. That's okay. Hopefully this makes it simpler to run this and see that sort of information come back. I'm authenticated. Sure enough, I get the same 4 contacts back. I didn't have to strong type anything. Now, there's also going to be a case where I might want to create something that way. Let's say I want to be very lightweight in my processing. I don't want to have to declare a lot of things. I can instead jump to an operation I created to do the same thing from a create perspective. And here I'm using this expando object here, which lets me create a dynamic object up front, define some parameters that I know are required by this object when I send it over the force. And here I can still do a create, pass that in, and pass in again that dynamic object, which really gives you a lot of flexibility if you're, again, building a really lightweight mobile app, or I don't want to necessarily embed a lot of types in here. I'm not dealing with SOAP, so I don't have this sort of WSDL concept where I have to have strong typing. Instead, I can work this way, where instead I'm interfacing with this very dynamic context. So in this case, if I run this, it should be able to create a new app contact, give me back an ID. If I jump back into my force interface and refresh this, sure enough, I see my new user. So again, really nice, simple way to do that sort of dynamic processing. The next thing I wanted to show you is custom controllers. So I'd seen this question when the toolkit was first released, which is, what happens when I build my own endpoint? Because there's a lot of reasons you're going to build your own endpoint. You might want to roll your own transaction needs. You might want to do some custom aggregation for how you collect data across entities, or just simply have some custom validation logic. So luckily, Force makes it really easy to do that, so that it's very straightforward to come in and define an Apex class that's decorated appropriately to expose a custom REST endpoint. So here I can have a get that returned a job application status. So for reference, I've created a job application object, and someone may be interested to look at that information and see what is the status of their particular job. So I could pull that through just this regular APIs, but let's say I want to have a custom object that defines an application status. And so I built a custom controller that responds to get, put, post, delete operations and returns that information back. So by default, it's a little tricky to use the default object that is in the toolkit because it puts together a specific format for the string, and that's not the format used when you're doing Apex calls. But luckily, again, I guess the lovely part of dealing with open source is I really can just copy what Wade built and make a change to have a different string format that simply takes in that base URL you get back when you authenticate and appends the necessary endpoint that calls my custom controller. So now I can use really that same object, and the toolkit works nicely with this. So if we look at what that code really looks like, to call that custom endpoint, first I simply have my own little object that looks the same, where I'm going to pass in a custom endpoint there. And I simply call the get, and you'll see what happens is you're really passing out a package name, and then the rest of the path that you called out in your custom Apex controller. So in this case, I'm sending a request to my custom Apex endpoint in my controller, getting back a job status ID. So if I run this is for 0004, I should get back a status for this particular person's job request. And sure enough, I can see for that job it was submitted. So that's interesting. The last demo I'm going to show you then is, I think mashups are pretty awesome. So as you have toolkits like this, the whole point, really the whole point of the webinar is, how do I build some custom apps with this? How do I take advantage of these technologies to combine things in cool and interesting ways? So what I went ahead and did is work with Twilio. So Twilio is a great service for doing voice and SMS interactions both inbound and outbound. You can buy phone numbers and have them respond in certain ways. Think of IVR scenarios and collecting data and responding. So the whole thing that runs on is it's based on some commands. I built an ASP.NET Web API service that responds to requests inbound and creates a response that Twilio expects. So Twilio has an XML sort of structure that tells it what to do. So in this case, when you call this phone number, I'm going to build up a response that says, thanks for calling that status hotline, and I'll make it a woman say hi. I'm hosting this whole thing in Azure for fun. So I'm going to start collecting information. So I can tell it to collect some info, and I'm going to say, give me the job ID. And so the person will then type in some digits. Now I'm telling it what to do when it collects them, and I'm telling it to call another endpoint after it collects 6 numbers. And that other endpoint is in this also web API operation. So it's going to call this endpoint and take in those parameters. And I'm going to find out the digits they typed in. And now I'm doing that same call, where I'm calling that endpoint using the async. I'm doing await here to make sure I'm pausing to get those credentials. I'm doing my custom service again to call my custom endpoint, getting that back, and then I'm going to respond with a particular string that says, for that job that you've requested, here's your status. And I'm going to pull that information back that comes from Salesforce. So I'm using Salesforce as my, let's say, recruiting tool. and now I'm exposing that via voice thanks to the toolkit, I have a lot of different ways I can consume that information, even if those people aren't going to be Salesforce users. Imagine this being a mobile app, or in this case, SMS or voice. So if we look at what this looks like when I deployed this up to Windows Azure, I've got a Twilio number that I've purchased, and I can tell Twilio, okay, when somebody calls you, hit this URL to get the XML that tells you what to do, and go ahead and do it over an HTTP GET so I can actually get the result back. So that first result, this is what we have in the ASP.NET Web API service, is it returns a little constructor that builds this structure. So it says, thanks for calling that hotline, get the data, please enter a job application ID. When I call that, it's doing this lookup that for that job, here's the job status. So for each ID in the system, it's actually querying Salesforce using the toolkit and returning that back. So for kicks, let's go ahead and call that number from Skype on my other machine. And it's going to go ahead and call that.
Thanks for calling the status hotline. Please enter job application ID. For job Windows Administrator, job status is under review.
So it told you for the administrator the job status was under review when I did 0005, that it was able to quickly call the Salesforce endpoint and pull that information back. So again, hopefully some pretty cool ways to mash up technology and see how these things can work together. Thanks to the toolkit, it's really a neat way to combine these things. Wade, let me throw that back to you.
Great, thanks so much. That was a great demonstration of what you can end up doing with this. So I'm going to go ahead and let me grab control again. And I'm going to end this by giving one quick demonstration here. I won't spend a ton of time walking through the code, but what I've got up here on the screen is Xamarin. And so you can see that I'm on my Mac, I'm in OS X, and I'm using Xamarin Studio. And what's great about Xamarin Studio is it allows me to use mono.NET so that I can build iOS and Android applications using the exact same NuGet packages that I used on my PC and that you saw Richard use for his demonstrations. And you can see we're targeting .NET 4.5. You can see the developer.force.force NuGet package here. And let me go ahead and just stop and then rerun this again. And you'll see that the iOS simulator is going to pop up. It's going to make a call out to force.com APIs. And you can see we're returning back these accounts. So the nice thing about this is since we've used portable class libraries, since we've made sure that this is compatible with mono.NET, you can use the same code and the same skills and the same experiences you have as a .NET developer to now build experiences that integrate with Salesforce on an iOS and Android device. So I hope you find that interesting and that the work that we've done for that you find valuable. So a couple of housekeeping items here. So here's, feel free to grab a screenshot or whatever you might need here. But here's some URLs and some resources that you can use to learn a little bit more. Of course, GitHub is the home for almost all of this. All of our source control all of our source is open source there. You can get access to all the samples, to the accelerators, and even to the underlying libraries. So I think Richard's demonstration about how he extended it was pretty impactful. So all of that is up on GitHub. I do encourage you to take advantage of issues. So if you find any bugs, or if you would like us to support some things that perhaps we don't today, please file that under the issues and mark it appropriately. And certainly I will be paying attention and do what I can. Of course, you can grab all this stuff via NuGet, and you can take a look at everything that's available there. And then last but not least, I routinely blog about this information. So please take a look at my blog and some of the resources that have been published there. So call to action. Hopefully, it's pretty apparent what some next steps should be if you want to move forward with using .NET to integrate with Salesforce. Of course, you can take a look at the GitHub repository and the code and documentation. I encourage you, if you don't already have one, to create a developer edition organization and set up a connected app. You need that connected app in order to integrate and to communicate with the force.com APIs. Clone the repository. Try out the samples, download the samples, do what you need to. Install the accelerators. If you have additional ideas, let us know. But most importantly, build some apps, build some fantastic experiences for your customers and for your users using the tools that you do today. And with that, what I'm going to end up doing is, please take a look and go up here to this survey and give us some feedback. And be honest. If you don't like having the presentation end for a few minutes in the middle of it, let us know. We don't like that either. So again, very humble apologies for that happening during the webinar. I appreciate all of you that stuck through. But give us some feedback, and feel free to let us know if you've used these, if you plan to use the toolkits, and so forth. And at this point, what I'll do is I will take a look at our questions and see if there are any additional questions that are in the queue that haven't been answered. And I'm happy to take a look at them. All right, so let's see. So there was a question: what is the difference between the way that you communicated in the command line example with the web example? So the reason I showed the console app as well as the web app is the OAuth dance, if you will, is slightly different. On the console app, I ended up using one of the authentication flows called username password. The problem with the username password flow is that it requires you to have not only a consumer secret and a consumer key, but a username and password. And in some cases, let's say you're deploying to a phone, or if you're on the web, you may not want to specify that username and password or even the secret. And so what the web server and the web example provided was a way to show you that you can have the user provide some of that information. In this case, it's the username password. So you build out a URL that directs you to a login page. And in that URL that you've built, you've included things like the consumer key. So that tells Salesforce, which organization this pertains to. But then it lets the user enter the username password. So I'd say that the primary difference between the two is that in the web version, the user is providing the username password. In the console version, we're using that username password flow, and so we're hard coding essentially that username password. There's another question: is there a way using the toolkit to upsert nested objects? That's a great question. So we do. The answer. Let me think about that. So the toolkit is really just wrapping around the API. So the underlying question should be: does our upsert allow you to upsert a nested object? And I am not entirely sure. I've not done that, and we'll look to see if we have another gentleman on the call, Quentin. If you want to take a go at that and answering that question, or if you're able to contribute, that would be fantastic. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. So Greg, I think you asked that question. I will track that down and follow up with you. So thanks for asking that. All right. Well, thank you everyone for making the time. I really appreciate it. Feel free to interact with Richard or I on Twitter if you have additional questions. You can use the hashtag. You can reach out to us directly, and we will talk to you then. Thank you very much.